Love it. All right, so we are going to put, here's what we're going to do. So the series, the reason we started it halfway through the month is because we needed to get it back into the purchase and sale, get into a regular rhythm of going through this. So how this format will be is the first Tuesday of the month will be the buyer side of the transaction. The second Tuesday will be focused on the seller side of the transaction. The third Tuesday will be focused on the purchase and sale. So we'll basically be going through the purchase and sale agreement. That'll be kind of repetitive, to be honest with you. But what will typically happen is I will have made notes of something that I'd seen since the last time we had it. And then the fourth Tuesday, what we're going to do is we're going to pick and choose based on what we're seeing. We'll get the topic out. In the event there are no topics, I'll always have a topic in mind, but we'll also do a roundtable for general questions to go ahead and set the stage for next week. Next week, we already have picked the topic. We're going to be focused 100% on paragraph 8 of the purchase and sale agreement. So we're going to be talking about repair procedure versus due diligence versus as is. That's going to cover notices, how to give notices, proper way to give repair notices during repair procedure, proper way to terminate them, what the difference between a release and a termination is, and go through all of those. So Jan has a question about putting in a backup offer. So on the questions that are specific to outside of them, I'll parking lot them. And if we can get to them in the end, I absolutely will. If not, then I'll just follow up with you specifically on that one. So before we dive in, because we've got about 31 people in here, this is good. Here's what I want this to be. What I have found, and everybody learns differently, but what I have found is 9 times out of 10, the best way to just get familiar with the purchase and sale agreement is to keep going through the purchase and sale agreement. What I learned early on is there's no such thing as it's not my job as it relates to contracts in the real estate business. So if you're on a team, if you're on your own, if you have a contract to close, you may have people that handle different parts of your business, but as far as knowledge of the contract, you need to know that, particularly now. Bottom line is emotions are incredibly high right now. And the contract really gives us a place to go back to the agreement that we had, take emotions out of it. And the more you know the contract, the easier that is. So we're going to read through it today. I'm going to cover some things that have come up in the last couple of weeks, but we're basically going to read through, it's going to start fairly basic. I understand, and some of you may get bored with it. However, I'm going to encourage you to push through because typically some sort of discussion will come from that. So we make sure we cover everything. Before I get started, is there anything, is there anything in particular you want to make sure that I cover today on the purchase and sale agreement? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yes, please. Due diligence. Just leave some time to go into it a little bit more.
Okay, so the due diligence side, I will get into that as much as we can, but
specifically, I know next week is going to be more, but specifically the question I have about it is if there's termination, is the buyer required to pay that termination fee under any circumstance?
Okay. I'll make sure I get to that when we get into that one.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? All right, I know that Jan has the backup offer question in there, so I'm going to put that on there. I'll go through there. Anything else? And you can type it into the chat box if you're shy. All right, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. If you don't have, let me actually upload it as well. If you don't have a copy of the purchase and sale agreement, I will go ahead and put it in. Hold on. Share my screen first and go back to chat. Let me see if it's going to let me upload. See if it did. It did not. All right, let me try one more quick thing here. It's not letting me. Well, here's the first thing that we're going to do then. we're going to talk about the best place to go find all of your forms.
I saw it just now.
Well, that is good. I did have it up there, but I want to make sure you have a copy as well so you can take notes. So first thing I'm going to do is show the best place that I go to. Yes, you have it in DocuSign. You have everything there. The easiest and most, the best one as far as getting the most up-to-date one is SCR Forms. So if you see right now, scrrealtors.org/forms, if you see across the top. This will ask you to log in. It does ask you for your NRDS number, which I'm sure all of you have memorized. In the event you do not have that memorized, you can look it up. It'll allow you to look it up using your license number and your last name, or your last name and your email. And then it gives you this entire drop down here. So if you don't have a copy of the Form 310, just go do this and you will download it from the site here, and it'll have all the most up-to-date forms. This will be the best resource for up-to-date forms. Now, I know some of you are still transitioning out of .loop. .loop was always terrible at being a little behind on forms. We haven't had any recent updates to worry about now. However, DocuSign is normally pretty up to date, and you should be good to go on those. So, all right, so let's jump into the purchase and sale agreement. Now, this is going to be used on 90% of your contracts. The only time it won't be used is if you have a builder contract for new construction, if you are doing vacant land, or if you happen to use be using it for a condo. The first page is really a fill in the blank. Now understand a couple of different things as it relates to contract. Number one, the pre-printed is the standard. Okay, anything that is typed in a blank overrides pre-printed. Okay, so this is just kind of standard things to keep in mind on the contract. So if you know, I write something in special steps, or I write something in this blank here about closing attorney and who it should be, whatever I type in here would actually override if it conflicts with any pre-printed. So it's just something to keep in mind. For those of you that don't know, have never been to a contracts class that I've taught, my dad is a litigator. So I look at contracts in worst case scenario. I look at contracts of what happens when something goes wrong. Which, you know, the bad news is that's not a great way to maybe go through life. The good news is that making sure that that's what you're doing, because not only are you protecting your client, you're also protecting yourself from liability. Okay. So first thing to remember, anything typed in overwrites anything pre-printed, anything handwritten overwrites the other two. So anytime you have any conflicting parts of a contract, just remember that's kind of the order of chain of command, for lack of a better way to put it. First part, paragraph 1, is pretty self-explanatory. Fill out the information, the parties of the contract. And then in addition to that, you're going to have a couple of things predefined for you, who the parties are, the brokers, the closing attorney. A lot of people ask if the closing attorney has to be filled in. It does not have to be filled in. Just keep in mind though that this is where it defaults that it's selected by the buyer. Now, this is the first time in the contract, first of many times in the contract, that you can use the contract as a script to consult with your client. So if I'm representing a seller and I go through the contract right here, I'm going to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, they've chosen Butler & College as their closing attorney. Understand in South Carolina that all real estate closings are handled by attorneys. You do not have to use Butler & College as well. You can select your own. It's completely up to you. And then you can allow them to decide one way or the other. Effective date's an important one to know. Not as important in the updated contract because we don't really we don't do a lot of counting of days. Everything's pretty much deadlined now. But effective date is the actual date when all parties have finalized their required signatures, which includes initials. Good funds is what's transferring. Time is basically stating that time is of the essence. Make sure that when you have a stipulated time and a deadline, it actually is a stipulated time and deadline, and you have to follow it. So far, so good. Super exciting stuff. Going down to above paragraph 2, this is basically where you're going to acknowledge whether or not any of the parties are real estate licensee, and you're also going to have both parties initial that they have received the South Carolina Disclosure of Brokerage Relationships, and they have agreed to be working, they are either working as a client or a customer service in this transaction. Customer service is a transaction broker, just so you know. This does not overwrite right now the requirement of having the South Carolina Disclosure of Brokerage Relationships as part of your required files. Again, the week 3 of the series isn't going to really go into what's required for the files. That's going to be covered in the buyer side and the seller side. But just keep in mind, we do keep them separately. Any reason, we'll get some interaction here. Any reason that you would think that we're keeping both, because we have this on page 1 and also keeping the disclosure of real estate relationships as having both required for your files? Any guesses on that? Oh, this is going to be a fun one. Right. It's a really complicated answer. To double up on covering our tails. Because keep in mind, and you have to understand, explaining a real estate contract to you will become second nature. It's not that way to your clients. Even if they've bought and sold 100 homes, you have to keep in mind that they're signing a 9-page document that where we think is simple. This is probably one of fewer than 3 or 4 times than they've actually had to sign a document like that. So just having this initial on the first page really does not, they're going to breeze through a lot of this. So it's really just to double cover yourself. So let's go back now to, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Get out of here. All right, so back to the contract. So paragraph 2, purchase price. This is where you're putting in the purchase price. Not going to get too bogged down in the details on this. However, unless it is 100% cash or 100% financing, it is actually going to be a combination of both financing and cash. So just something you want to keep in mind in here. If they are putting any money down, that technically you are going to be selecting a combination of finance and cash. So if you just click finance, again, it's technicality, doesn't really matter at this point in the contract. However, it's something to keep in mind. All right, so we're now entering the part of the contract that is causing one of the many different pieces of heartburn that we're seeing right now. And that is this last part of paragraph 2 that says this contract either is or is not contingent upon the sale and closing of a buyer's real property, and South Carolina Form 504 is or is not attached. Now, I'm going to go back and try this audience participation thing and see how it works out. Why do you think this is causing so much turmoil right now?
The seller might not want to take the contract contingent on somebody needing to sell on their property first.
Okay, so from a conceptual standpoint, yes, right now sellers may not be real open to that. Quite honestly, in some parts of our market, they may not need to be, right? What else? What else do you see this causing a problem right now?
When people don't fill out the form.
One of 2 things. Number 1, they don't attach Form 504. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Not a great thing.
I think it's a bad thing.
Okay, anybody think it's a good thing?
Wouldn't it invalidate the entire contract if it's not attached or filled out?
Well, if they select that it's attached and it's not, you could argue that it does. But let's say that you get an offer, or let's just say we have a contract that says that it is contingent on a home selling, but Form 504 is not included. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I would think everybody would want to know when the other property is scheduled to close so you can line up your own closing.
Okay. Are you thinking of that as a buyer's agent or the listing agent?
Well, I think if I had the buyer and they needed to sell, I think it'd be stronger to give an offer to a seller who knew that the buyer's property might be already under contract, and when
Sure.
it's scheduled to close, if they're paying cash, if the other side is paying cash.
Yep. Okay. So here's the deal. As a buyer, take the agent out of it. If I'm a buyer and Form 504 isn't attached, that works in my favor, right? I mean, basically without Form 504, this simply says this contract's contingent on my home selling. It doesn't give any terms. It doesn't give any time frames, nothing like that. Now, you are constricted to the time frame of the closing in the contract. However, it's pretty open-ended. So from a buyer standpoint, one could argue that's not a bad thing. From a listing standpoint, it is my opinion, and I hope and encourage that it would be your opinion as well. As the listing agent, you absolutely should advise your client to, at a minimum, counter to ask for Form 504. And you want terms of how the contract works, or whether or not the property is on the market. You want to know details about the property, and then all the terms that are set up in Form 504. And we can come back to that. If we don't get it today, we'll slip it in at some point in time. But just want to keep in mind that Form 504 as a listing agent and a seller should be close to, if not a non-negotiable, right? You want to make sure that you've got that covered in there for your client. All right, let me pop up here. see, I have a question come in. So the question is, we do not need to submit Form 504? No, you don't need to. Any good listing agent's not going to, at least, any good listing agent is at a minimum going to question it. At a minimum going to question it. Now, there are a lot of things. Form 504 honestly could be another, maybe we do that to the 5th Tuesday when we have a long month. That there are a lot of things that need to be covered in this because the notice is given on that. They can get kind of tricky. But just keep in mind, it's not required. Now, going back to, I think it was Nicole that said the part of if they do have that it is attached, as it states right here, and then they don't attach it, you technically at that point have a voidable contract. It's not void. It just means it's voidable, which when can that be bad?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
If you have
They
a
get a
That's
better offer.
bad if the buyer can't close.
Right. So the question was, what's the problem with having a voidable contract in this scenario? And it's bad if the buyer can't close because then you have a voidable contract. And really at that point, you get a dispute of whether or not you had a valid contract in the first place.
Okay.
Right. Now, the chances of any of this happening are slim to none until something bad goes wrong. Right. And from your standpoint, you just want to make sure that you've covered and explained all this correctly to your client. All right. Paragraph 3. This is the description of the property. One couple things to keep in mind. Again, the more you know this can be a platform to consult your client to prevent conflict in the future. We're dealing with a very, very fun issue right now that's involved the broker of another company, which is always fun. And one of the things we talked about this morning is the concept of conflict only arises when there's a difference in expectations, right? And actually, if you're taking notes, write that down. Conflict only arises when there's a difference in expectations. Use the contract to set the expectation. Okay, so paragraph 3 describes the property. One part that's very important as you're consulting your seller in this, there are a couple of highlights in each contract. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, one thing to keep in mind in this contract is this sentence right here. This sentence right here basically says that once you go under contract, you're agreeing to maintain the inoperable condition of the property and any personal property that's conveying. Now, here's where you can have a conflict. Let's say I'm in repair procedure and they've asked for the refrigerator and personal property, and during inspection, the refrigerator comes up that the ice maker is not working. Is that covered in repair procedure? Okay. Per the contract,
No.
it is not, but per the contract, is the seller required to fix it?
Yes.
Why?
And same operable condition.
Exactly. If you don't believe me, I'll show you the receipt from where I bought a brand new refrigerator from Lowe's, because I did not explain this properly to my seller, and the refrigerator was in personal property, went through repair procedure, everything was fine. Everything came up. They asked for not a whole lot of stuff. These people very, very, very much wanted a working ice maker, and it did not work. So we had to buy a refrigerator. So that's just very important to keep in mind that if you have repair procedure, yet you have anything conveying that's personal property, you need to make sure that's an operable condition. Now, you can get around that. You can write in there an as-is condition or anything like that. All right, let's go back to not need 504. So check the box saying it is contingent, but also check that it is not attached. Correct. So if it is not attached, correct, you would want to attach that on there. Now this goes, let's also go back to, and Terry, I'll come back to your question here in a second. I want to go back to kind of the end game in all of this. The problem with going through a contracts class is we always talk about who's right and who's wrong. The purpose of the contract is what? What is the ultimate goal of a contract between a buyer and a seller?
To clearly get everyone to closing.
Correct. It's don't overcomplicate this. It's to get the buyer to close on their new house and the seller to close on the house they no longer want. Okay, for whatever reason. The goal of the contract is not to win the earnest money. Okay. Now you want to protect the earnest money in favor, and you want to protect your client, but never try to set yourself up. And you'd be surprised. I'm sure it would be nobody on here, but you'd be surprised at how many times says, well, if that happens, that my client gets the earnest money. I promise you, your client doesn't want the earnest money as their goal. If something goes wrong, they want it, but they're not writing the contract to win the earnest money when something goes wrong. So going back to the question about Form 504, from a buyer's agent standpoint, it's probably still smarter to include 504 because you want an offer that's going to be more acceptable to the seller. And oh, by the way, don't overestimate the ability of listing agents out there. There are some listing agents who may not realize that not having Form 504 doesn't protect their client. They accept it. They don't warn their client. 30 days goes by, you don't even have your home on the market yet, and the seller's annoyed, and they're all pointing back to you, and you're like, hey, I didn't have Form 504. I'm protected. I don't know that that's a win-win. So always communicate the expectations from the beginning. But Weston, specifically to your question, yeah, if you don't want to submit it with it, that's how you would do it. So the question that Jan asked, and then I think Terry was asking the same thing, is what if the seller's disclosure on the seller discloses on the seller's disclosure that the ice maker is not working? Good question. That's why I love having experienced agents on the class. Good question. So technically, because if they've checked that they filled out the seller's disclosure and that they've read it, technically your seller would be covered, right? It's saying, and we'll get to that paragraph, but just in a nutshell, it's basically saying, hey, as a seller, I filled it out honestly. As a buyer, I've read it and signed it. Okay, so that's the technical side of it. From a realistic and a practical side of it, if you know that something's not working, or if you see it in the personal property, you need to run it by your sellers again. Hey, they're asking for the refrigerator. Understand that even though we're going with repair procedure, which is better for us, we want to make sure that if anything comes up with the refrigerator or washer and dryer or any of those that are in personal property, that may fall in the category. I just want to double check with you. And then also you may want to go and they say, well, yeah, I disclosed it on the seller's disclosure. I would go and I would make sure the buyer's agent and the buyer understand that, and possibly even put it in there as is, or at least shoot an email that's doing it. Because I'm willing to bet that a lot of times buyers are initialing and signing a seller's disclosure that a property disclosure they haven't read all the way through. Okay. But specifically to the question, if it was disclosed, the seller would technically be protected. The other thing to keep in mind here, because we're getting this question a lot, this talks about everything that's covered. Leasing issues and items of financed equipment, also future vacation renters, Vacation Rental Act reservations. Understand that a lot of these they would transfer with the property. So people just need to understand that if you're dealing with property that does carry any sort of leases, or if you have any short-term rentals that lined up. Now, there's an entirely different discussion as to short-term rentals via actual short-term rental forms that are filled out than those that are done through VRBO, because you have different cancellation policies through them. Paragraph 3, as far as it relates to the property description, everything on here. So in a perfect world, you get a copy of the deed and you fill every bit of that out. In the real world, you want to have the address, the tax ID number, and any other information that you can get from the tax records. If you do not have it, dash through the blank. Don't leave them blank. Your most important thing is going to be your tax ID number, and you do want to confirm that that's correct and that it matches the property address. All right. Conveyance and closing. Sorry, I did skip the bottom of page 1. Personal property. This is where you would add anything. If this is going to be a long list of things, you may want to add an attachment. If you do add an attachment, there's no specific form for that you have to use. However, if you do just do some generic list, you do want to put both parties' initials on that list. So if you just do a separate Word document, just drop both parties' initials on the bottom. What I don't want to see, and I'm sure, again, nobody does this, is any personal property seen in the home in the MLS on August 10th, 2020, or a refrigerator as seen in the MLS. Nothing you referring to the MLS would be no different than referring to the Zillow ad or referring to the flyer that they misprinted. Right? The MLS, you've got to think is nothing more than an advertisement. If they want the refrigerator, not the refrigerator that was seen in the house on August 10th, 2020. They want the Kenmore F22, whatever it may be. You know, again, think long term. If you say refrigerator, could very much go get my beer fridge that's been sitting in my garage for the last 2 years, getting sweaty in the summertime and probably doesn't have another year left on it. So just make sure you're specific in these. And if the list does get lengthy, put it on a separate piece of paper so there's no misunderstanding. All right, let me.
In reference to the tax map number, when you look it up as the agent,
Yes.
and what do? You turn around and you ask the seller for the tax bill to verify it's the same tax number.
You can typically go into the tax records. We'll have the correct number in there. You can always ask them to sit, to verify that for you.
I just don't want them to say yeah, then turn around. I make a mistake, and then of course catastrophe happens at that point.
Yeah, I mean it's catastrophe is, well, I like the way you're thinking only because I like people to be scared of contracts, but we also have to keep in mind too that that's something like that can be fixable as long as it's caught early on. If there's any doubt in it, either reach out to me. Also understand when the attorneys do their title search and everything, they're going to verify this as well. That's typically further down the road. You don't want to wait that long. So Jackie's question is, what if it says all appliances? That clarify. If you're the listing agent and you get that offer, you need to pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm going to need you to list out what this means. Because all appliance, I mean, when, where, what do you consider an appliance, right? So you need to be as specific as possible on that one. All right, conveyance closing. One thing to keep in mind, we do not have the beloved automatic extension on these. Your closing date is at 5 p.m. on or before whatever date you put in here. It will be fee simple, subject to all easements, reservations, rights of way, etc., which will be checked by the attorney. This is basically saying that they're going to convey marketable title, which means that they can transfer it, right? Meaning there are no liens on it, there are no pending litigation on it. It'll be transferred over into the names of blank. Typically, people, if they put something in here, that's great. I'm really not sure why SCR still has left this blank in here, because people change their mind a lot of times between contract to close on where it is. It is not a required part of the contract. It's still a binding contract if this line is blank. This is just telling you how the property is going to be recorded. One of the things to keep in mind as it relates to closing, the day of closing belongs to the seller. Meaning that even if it closes at 9 in the morning, the day of closing belongs to the seller. So if something happens, for instance, we just had this, repairs were supposed to be done before the walkthrough on Thursday at 5. The walkthrough of Thursday at 5 was only put into writing by saying, hey, we're going to do a walkthrough on Thursday at 5. The buyers showed up, repairs were not done. Buyers want to cancel the contract or trying to claim that the sellers didn't perform. The sellers technically have until 5 o'clock the day of closing, or in a reasonable amount of time for a closing to occur by 5 o'clock, for them to perform on the contract unless otherwise noted in the contract. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. I keep looking at the chat box just to make sure I don't miss anything. Anything else on that one? No. Nope. Oh, do understand in this last sentence, I do want to point this out. Sellers shall convey possession of vacant and reasonably clean property, free of debris, along with all keys, codes, and remote controls, available documents, and similar ownership items to buyer at closing. This is all the contract says. The contract does not require, it says shall. Shall means if you can. All right. So if if your seller only has 2 keys to the property, or they only have their 1 key to the property that you have because they never locked their door, you need to make sure that the buyer's agent understands that. If your buyer wants more, you need to ask for it in the contract. but it gives you a basic of what's going to happen here. Reasonably clean is not professionally cleaned. This is a fun debate that we get in quite often. There's a difference between what a contract says and what common decency is. Okay. I understand that most people have pride of ownership. They would never even think of walking out of their house before wiping the floor, sweeping the floors and wiping everything down. That's what some reasonable people think. Then there are people who just got done packing a house of 5 kids in the middle of August in Charleston. They're running late because they waited the last minute, and all they know is they need to be out of the house by 10 o'clock on Friday. They don't care how clean the property is, they're going to get out. So you need to make sure, if you think, talk to your buyer, if you think that they're going to be the type of person that wants the house professionally cleaned, you might want to ask for it. It is not required if it is not put in the contract. Reasonably clean is in the eyes of the beholder. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you what it is. All right. Let's keep on running now. Okay, earnest money. Earnest money. I love earnest money. So earnest money, basically, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, earnest money. By the way, you'll catch on. I randomly will start throwing in scripts. Okay, so you want to go back and watch these, and then as we break them down into sections, you want to watch that too. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, when the buyer submits an offer, this is if I'm reviewing the contract before they've gotten one, or if I'm reviewing the offer that they've gotten, the buyer is putting in earnest money. The earnest money is basically saying, Mr. Seller, I promise to do everything I can to stay within the contract. And if I don't, and I breach, then I'm going to give you this money for you as a sorry. So that's what this paragraph right here means. Now, Mr. Seller, what this paragraph means here is that everything I just said on the paragraph before doesn't really matter unless I agree. So Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I promise you to give the money if I default on the contract. But if I don't think I defaulted on the contract, even though it's super, super clear that I did, you're still not getting your earnest money until everyone agrees or until a court tells the attorney to do so. This second part of paragraph 5 is probably more important to explain to your seller than the first part is. Because like I said, it can be night and day, crystal clear that the buyer could show up to the closing and say, I don't like the color shirt you're wearing, I want out. If they don't sign to release the earnest money, the sellers don't get it. Okay, so they just need to understand that, so you're not setting them up for some, a buyer that's gone rogue, and all of a sudden they're calling Butler College or Weeks in Irvine and saying, give me my earnest money. So just keep in mind that it is a promise to perform, and in order for it to be released, it has to be agreed upon by all parties, or if legal action occurs. With me so far? All right, so let's talk about the breakdown of the earnest money. There's going to be a total amount of earnest money, and it's going to be broken up in 2 ways. One of 2 ways, I should say. It's either going to be all given up front, 3 ways. All given up front, all given in a couple days, or split over time. To protect yourself as the buyer's agent, I would say the total goes here, and unless you have the check in your hand, 0 goes into what's accompanied by the offer, and the $1,000 will be paid by 6 p.m. on whatever date it may be. Okay? You need to stop becoming, like it or not, I know some of you aren't going to love this because you love being the absolute everything in every part of the transaction, and I so appreciate that. I absolutely do. I don't mean this to sound as smug as it does. And you are opening yourself up to a lot of risk. The best way to protect yourself is to select the second part here and say the $1,000 will be paid by 6 p.m. on whatever date, and say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, what date will you be able to give this money to whatever escrow person is holding the earnest money? Okay. You need to start putting that responsibility onto the client, especially now that we don't hold earnest money, which is not, for most of you that have not, that hasn't been an issue, because as long as you've been Kel Williams, we haven't hold it. The new dates as opposed to days from effective date. Say agent negotiates a few days past the date and here think they ratify. Would there be any automatic change? Okay, so great question. So Ellie just asked a really good question that says, and this happens, and this is unfortunately one of the areas that probably wasn't a terrible idea to keep business days in there. But what happens if the offer gets submitted today is the 18th, and they say they'll have the earnest money to the attorney by the 19th at 6 p.m. And let's say they negotiate until tomorrow afternoon at 5. Technically, you would have had to change the date on here. And here's why. Let's go to the second part of this. Parties direct escrow agent to communicate reasonable information confirming the receipt. And then in the event, if earnest money is not delivered, get out of here, upon the date above, seller may, doesn't have to, may terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination. Anytime it says delivering notice of termination, that is a unilateral act. Meaning, going back to Ellie's example, so let's say Ellie's negotiating a situation and we don't ratify till tomorrow at 5. Obviously, the buyer's not going to get the earnest money to the attorney until Thursday. We got a crazy seller. Something crazy happens over here. We get another offer on the table that's better than your first offer. If that earnest money is not turned in, all I have to do as a seller is send an email to you saying you did not turn in the earnest money per paragraph 5. I'm terminating the contract. And buyer has no recourse because they did not get it turned in on time. So you do want to make sure, by the way, we've had that happen. We've had that specific situation happen where the negotiations took longer and we were past the due date. Here's the other thing that we've happened. We've had the due date of the earnest money happen. I think for whatever reason it was done. I think if they had ratified on a Thursday or Friday, then the due date of the earnest money was not until the following Wednesday. Repair procedure. The inspection happened on Monday. Nothing really wrong as far as the house was concerned that the seller wasn't willing to do. However, the buyer was like, I'm out. I haven't turned in my earnest money. What are you going to do? Right? So you want to make sure you kind of are understanding if you don't put some unreasonable time frame for the earnest money to be way out. Make sense? Can't tell if some of you are just enthralled by this or you're just like, oh, this is exciting. All right. Questions. Oh yeah, and to clarify, one of the questions that the second part of Ellie's question, because this is an important part, it said, would there be any automatic change, or would it just be considered not ratified until the date is updated? It's not that it's considered not ratified. It's considered ratified when everyone signs. However, if that, let's say the signing was happened after this date that's given right here, you technically would then automatically have a voidable contract by the buyer, excuse me, by the seller. All right. Paragraph 6. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're doing good. Paragraph 6. So this is where it lays out what the typical transaction costs are for the buyer and the seller. It lays out in here everything that is going to be the natural responsibility of either side. The good news is this contract now tells you all costs that are obtained to obtain information from the homeowners association, also includes any capital contributions, anything like that. You need to check off seller, you need to check off buyer. If it is not checked, it will be added to the seller's transaction costs. Here's, by the way, if you're a listing agent, you need to put on your listing checklist for your pre-listing consultation, or your listing consultation is for the seller to confirm with their HOA that there are no capital contribution costs. Because what has happened is we've had sellers that have lived in their neighborhood since the beginning of time. And when they first moved in, they were super involved in the HOA. They knew everything that was going on, and they just aren't anymore. And in the last HOA meeting, it was voted that there's a capital contribution the sellers didn't know about. They didn't care about negotiating this. And then the next thing you know, they've got $2,500 that they're paying at closing for capital contribution. So just to protect yourself, you want to have as part of your listing consultation that they are going to confirm with the HOA. Okay. If you are going to take that on yourself, that is fine. I would encourage you to copy the seller on there as well, so they see all the communication. Questions? Awesome. Seller will pay buyer's transaction costs not to exceed a dollar amount. It also tells you everything what's involved in that, non-allowables, all of those things. A couple different things to keep in mind on here. Number one, this is a dollar amount, not a percentage. So if you are negotiating, you want to be mindful of that and change the dollar amount. Number two, it has been asked, can that be struck and made a percentage? It can. Just keep in mind, if you're changing a contract, you're technically practicing law. So you just want to make sure that you have that reviewed. Now, again, if you're simply changing it to a percentage, then you will, obviously that will be noticed. However, you would probably be smart to over communicate that with the listing agent. Hey, to keep it easy, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, instead of putting $2,500 in there, we just put 2% because we knew that the seller would probably negotiate the price. So just want to make sure that you saw that. The question is can you write all buyers' closing costs in the blank? You cannot. There has to be a number on there because then there also will be certain allowables. You also, as a buyer's agent, you need to be very, very clear that you're communicating with the lender of how much they actually can use. Some lenders are very, very strict on this, and they will not allow more than a certain amount. That's based on the type of loan, the type of buyer, and everything. There are some more liberal loans that will allow you to take a giant amount of closing costs, right? But if you write, I'm pausing because this actually happened. If you write on a contract, it actually happened with someone who's on the call before they were an agent. You write in the contract that the seller is going to be paying up to a certain amount of closing costs, and then it is not allowed. The seller does not have to pay it, and the seller does not have to go back and renegotiate the contract. The seller just got more money. And you absolutely, under any circumstances, cannot cut a check directly to the buyer outside of closing at all. And you'd be surprised. I had that asked this week. It cannot happen. So just keep in mind. All right. Non-allowables and allowables. I knew somebody was going to ask that question. I try to speed through that so nobody asks. Honestly, that's very often up to the lender, right? So that's why when you go, that's why I always say this, by the way, this goes back to something, and I'm going to get to this in another paragraph. This goes back to engaging all the parties in the transaction to say, hey, Weston, I know you're doing the loan for Eileen on this closing. She said that she's talked to you about asking, $4,500 in closing costs. I don't want to get into the details of what's allowed and what's not. However, if they agree to this price, are you going to allow them to contribute the full $4,500? Do we know for a fact that that's going to be distributed to you? And I would try to get, I'm not saying not know the answer, and I'm not trying to be too vague on it, but I also am, because you want to make sure that you're not getting involved in the details of it that don't need to be, other than the fact that she's able to get the $4,500. If that makes sense. Okay. All right. Let's jump down to financing. Couple different things on financing that we're seeing right now. So the contract either is or is not contingent on obtaining financing, a 30 or 15 year or other. Don't be too flippant on filling this out. You want to stay fairly detailed, not so much in the percentages. I used to spend a lot of time on this to say, well, don't put 15 because, or if they, if they wanted to get a 30, but you put in here, they're getting a 15 and they get qualified. And then you say that you don't want to do it because of the terms. You still could do it. Don't get too bogged down on that. What you do want to get bogged down on is you want to look at the maximum type of financing, right? The higher you get on here, you want to really probably have a conversation with the buyer's agent if you're the listing, or even the lender. And there is no problem with a buyer's agent speaking to a lender. I know a lot of people really have some heartburn on that. I just don't know that I'd be the listing agent, listing agent speaking to lender. I just don't know that I'm going to be the listing agent that's going to be barging into the lender's office when you're pissed off about something. Right? There's a difference between opening up communication at the beginning of the transaction and then coming in trying to save the day. That's where things go wrong. So if you get an offer on this, absolutely. If you have any questions about it, you can reach out to it, find out what's going on. So the higher the percentage you have here, you just want to be aware of that to make sure that that's going to be reasonable and that you're not putting your sellers at risk. The buyer shall, apply for financing by this date. This apply for financing, in my opinion, should not be more than 2 business days. If a buyer is not able to fully apply for financing within 2 business days of going under contract, that's a red flag for me. They should be ready to do this. I don't know that that's a hill I'm going to die on. However, I'm definitely not going to take, 2 weeks from now, a week from now would give me heartburn. So you just want to make sure that you have the fact that they are going to be fully applying, not a pre-approval, right? Or pre-qualification, but they're actually going for application. Then you want the pre-approval letter with no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by whatever date this may be. Now, this used to be back in the day. This is where you put the final approval date. Everyone would write in by closing. And then we just got lazy and we got used to that, me included. And then so they changed it to have no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by blank. No repairs required prior to this notice, by the way. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan. This is a very important sentence. The final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan, right? So if they've hit this, they've given notice to seller, they have pre-final approval, and they have no unreasonable credit, income, or assets, everything's fine. Still, final loan approval does not occur until the lender funds the loan. So you just want to keep in mind that you're still kind of at risk up until the very end. That's why it's so important to make sure that they don't have any unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions. So if you do have someone that does have something fall apart at the last minute because of something that should have been disclosed, or that something that might be unreasonable, they wouldn't be protected by the financing contingency. All right, so the question is two things. Seller can't write a check for buyer after closing. What about the rent paid at post occupancy? Okay, Sarah, great question. Sorry, I do want to back up on this. So when I said this, the seller cannot, let me rephrase that. I was speaking specifically to any sort of closing costs the seller agreed to pay that the buyer didn't get. Seller, let's reword that. Seller cannot pay, no party in the transaction can pay the other party in the transaction without it fully being disclosed by everyone. So it's either going to be in the contract, which would cover your post occupancy, or it'll be on the settlement statement. Typically, the post occupancy would not be on the settlement statement, obviously, if they stayed longer than it was agreed upon, but sometimes they will be paid in advance, depending on how you do that. You say 2 days to apply. What if negotiations go on for an extra day, just like escrow? Does this have to be changed in the contract? So they do have 2 days to apply, yes. So again, this would be another area which may not have been a terrible idea to keep business days in there. They did keep it in the next stipulation, which we're about to cover. But yes, if you did take some time on negotiations, you would have to go back and renegotiate or change this. And keep in mind, if you change this, meaning you strike it and you initial it, any strike or change that's initialed, the initials have to be closed. I'm going to come back to that. I don't want to bog you down in initials closed. There's one person, I don't know who all's on here, but there's a couple people that are very sensitive right now to having closed initials on a contract. I shouldn't laugh. All right, so let's jump down to this part right here. If the buyer changes their lender during the financing period, they must notify the seller within blank calendar days. I think this needs to be no more than 2 days. I mean, if you're going to change your lender, you need to let them know right away. That being said, if you're representing a buyer and they say, hey, I want to change the lender, this next sentence is extremely important. Absent written approval by the seller, buyer cannot change the lender if closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. This is super important. Buyer comes in, they've gotten pre-approved by Fastlane Mortgage online, and they've got a wonderful rate of 3%. And then they come back and they get their final numbers and it's actually 6%. So they're saying, well, crap, now I want to go with movement. They cannot change to movement if that's going to change the closing date unless the seller agrees. That's very, very important that you remember that. So you do want to make sure as part of your buyer consult, when you're talking to them about financing, that they're positive that the lender with whom that they are working, that's the one they're going to use, because if they do need to change it and it changes the closing date, the seller does not have to participate and the buyer's running risk of being a default of the contract. If lender subsequently declines or fails to approve financing, buyer shall notify the seller and brokers as soon as possible. If the seller or brokers are notified of inability to obtain financing during the financing period, either party may terminate this contract by notice. Last part of this to keep in mind. I've seen this a little bit lately too. FHA, VA, conventional, or seller financing. You're really going to see mainly one of these first three. Get out of here. Oh, great. It highlighted what I didn't want it to. pretend FHA, VA, and conventional are highlighted. Those are going to be the main ones that you see. An FHA or VA financing addendum is or is not attached. I'm seeing a lot of these where people default to is attached, and then they are not attached. This is bad for two reasons. One, technically makes a voidable contract. The chances of that being exercised are slim to none. Number two is the the sellers are not given the extra notice that they will be participating at a little bit higher of a level because of the FHA and or VA appraisal, and that they may need to be doing some additional repairs. Now, keep in mind, nowhere, we just got into a big debate about this, nowhere does it obligate the seller to absolutely do repairs required by a VA or an FHA appraisal. It is written just like the CL 100 is, meaning they have to per the contract, but should they not do it, then the buyer has the option to terminate the contract without penalty. That's a big mix-up we have going on at this moment, where the seller, everyone on the buyer side is saying our seller should have known they should have had to do these. Yes, they know they had to do them, but they also know if they don't do them that they can just be released from the contract. So make sure that that's explained as it relates to those two types of financing. Go back to question. Okay, so the question is what are your options as a seller if the buyer does change the lender and the closing is pushed because of it? Like anything in a contract, what they've basically done over the years is they've tightened the contract up to prevent laziness, right? This move was to tighten up buyers shopping until after they'd gone under contract. Totally understand why. Like anything in the contract, the seller, everyone still has the option to renegotiate should they want to, right? So if some, if I'm representing, if I've got a seller and Jan comes in and she says, hey, we've had a big problem with this lender. Buyer wants to switch lenders. This guy's, here's all the information. We've got pre-approval. We're ready to go. However, they are going to possibly need another week. Can we do that? That communication has probably been good with Jan from the beginning, and that's going to be a lot easier for me to deliver to the sellers. It's the surprises that really throw people off. So from a seller standpoint, Sarah, you can agree to change it. So if you do find out from the lender that they're shopping, and you just let your sellers know, and if the sellers want to extend it, they can. Again, they're not set up in here to have a winner and loser in every situation. They're just set there to to protect the clients in each one. All right, questions so far? Okay. Everybody take a deep breath. Raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I state your name.
I'm Kathy Goldthorpe.
I state your name. Will not freak out. All right. Amen. Okay, so let's go to paragraph 8. Now, we are going to spend the majority of next call going through the intricacies of paragraph 8. So I am going to go through this fairly quickly, which is in no way, shape, or form indicative of the importance of the paragraph. This paragraph right now, which is why we have a whole week going to be dedicated to it, is the cause of the most conflict that we have right now. Okay. So I'm going to go through in a nutshell what it looks like, and then we're going to go through and dissect each one at some level, and then we'll see if anybody's still awake, and then we'll go from there. So when you purchase a contract or purchase a property, you have 3 options in your contract on how you can inspect the property. You have what's called the repair procedure, you have due diligence, and you have as is. And I'm going to explain them backwards because they're easier to explain that way. If you purchase a contract that is as is, it is exactly what it says. You have purchased the house. There is no option to not purchase the house once you ratify this contract. So when you purchase a house as is, you've basically said, I will get it inspected, and I retain the right to inspect it by 6 p.m. on this date, and it's for informational purposes only. The seller has no obligation to remedy any issues that the buyer discovers during the inspections. I'm buying the house no matter what. The inspection is just to tell me how bad it is and what I have on my plate. It's nothing more, nothing less. Very simple. So if a buyer goes as is, they're not getting out. Okay? There's not even saying you can get out because of the inspection. It is simply for informational purposes only. We are seeing these being used. We currently are we do have one where this is being done. Now, as is does not override the CO 100. That is part of the confusion with some people now. You can have an as-is contract that's still contingent on the CL 100. They're two separate things. So keep in mind. Due diligence. Due diligence says that I'm going to purchase this property, and on or before whatever date I put right here on page 3, I'm going to have the house inspected by anyone and everyone that I want. I'm then going to find out everything that I want to ask the seller for to fix or not fix. And then I'm going to deliver requests to them to either fix them. And then I'm going to amend the contract accordingly. And if I do one of these 5 things that's listed right here on or before this date up here, then I stay in the contract. If I do not, then I move forward with the property as is. Okay, so Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's what the due diligence contract says. It says, we've got a buyer here, Steve Kelleher. Steve seems like an awesome buyer. Here's what Steve's due diligence period is. Anywhere between now and that, or any time between now and the date that he's put on page 3, Steve can get out of this contract if he simply doesn't like the way that the thunder sounds on an afternoon thunderstorm. It does not have to be rational. It does not have to make sense. It is protected in the contract, though. Now, I don't tell you that, Mr. Seller, to freak you out, but I do want to make sure that I'm very, very clear that during due diligence, you really can kind of look at it as maybe not having a contract. Now, Mr. Kelleher could have been nice. He could have added a termination fee here that says, you know what, I will do that. And if I do terminate, regardless of the reason, I'll pay you X amount. I'm seeing anywhere from $500 to $1,000. Seeing some people try to ask for the same amount as the earnest money. Everybody asks me what's the best. The best is what your clients are going to accept. I don't think it's irrational to ask for something, though. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if I'm going to take my home off the market for 2 weeks, I'm fine to do that. But at a minimum, I'd ask that you give me $500 if you're just going to walk. A couple things on the repair procedure, or excuse me, on the repair addendum and due diligence. Repair addendum, which we will come back to if I have time today. If not, we'll cover it next week. Repair addendum has its own time frame. It sets its own expectations. It sets when things are to be completed. It is a addendum in a box that's perfect for due diligence and not supposed to be used for repair procedure, even though every single one of you probably do. The repair addendum is designed specifically, I can't say solely, specifically for due diligence. That's the form 525 with all repair requests. Let's see what we got for questions. Okay, so Ellie asks if seller has zero interest in allowing them to extend, then question mark. All right, so if I understand correctly, you're in due diligence, and for whatever reason, we're come down to the wire. We've come down to, it's 12 noon on the day of this expiration of the due diligence on page 3. And you haven't come to an agreement, and the seller is absolutely has not agreed to extend the contract. If you're representing the buyer, first of all, you always need to see what your client wants you to do. And in that case, I would go back to Ellie and I would say, Ellie, here's the deal. We haven't come to an agreement on this per the due diligence contract or paragraph in the contract. If we don't have an answer, or if we don't have one of these 5 things done by 6 o'clock today, the contract states that you're going to be buying the house as is. Oh, it's for the lender section. Well, I'm going to answer the question anyway, because this does happen. So if the seller does not agree to extend this, that you're technically buying the contract as is. So here's what I would suggest. We draw up a notice of termination. And if we don't hear back from the listing agent by, let's say, what time's the thing, 6 p.m. If we don't hear back from them by 5:30, then I'll send it over. At that point, we're technically out of the contract because we've given notice of termination. We can always go back and renegotiate should the seller want to come back to the table. But that's really the only way that you can protect your buyer in that, should you not get an answer from the seller. So just important that you share that with them. To your question, Ellie, about extending during the if they switch lenders, if the change of date is switched because of the change in lender, the seller's not obligated to do it. And so the buyer can terminate at that point. I'll have to get back to you on whether or not that's considered default. I think it would be, It would be based on the situation of why they're switching lenders, but I'll have to get back to you on that one. Is the term fee in place of earnest money or in addition to earnest money if buyer seller want to get out during the due diligence? So good question, Waverly. So what basically the fee that's covered here in due diligence is separate from earnest money. Where's the blank? Sorry. So this fee right here, this is basically saying that when they unilaterally terminate the contract, that they're going to deliver a termination fee of X amount in a check. Now, typically what we're seeing that happen is they're actually sending a release instead of a notice of termination, and they're just paying the buyer that, or excuse me, the seller that out of their earnest money. So if the termination fee was $500, there's a $2,000 earnest money. Typically what's happening is they're sending a release of contract at that point that says $1,500 going back to the buyer, $500 going to the seller. How it's technically written is they write the check separately. It's probably easier to get this done because then you're not having to go track the buyer down in the event they say, yeah, the check's in the mail. All right, so we've got as is, we've got due diligence. By the way, this is very important. Delivery of a repair request does not extend the due diligence period. There are still some people who think that it does. It does not. So if you don't have your answers in time to give the seller enough time to respond, you may want to go ahead and start talking about extending the due diligence period. There are a couple people who like to use certain last minute tactics because they think that'll work. I have found 9 times out of 10, the emotion of the client is going to cause the client to terminate, not act irrationally. Right. So if it's one of those where you're going to try to submit it last minute so the seller accepts it, I think you're running more of the risk of seller saying, walk. I'm not going to do anything if you're going to submit it to me in the last minute. Because if you don't terminate by the end of the day tomorrow, you're buying as is. So just be careful in trying to play those games. Again, conflict only arises when there's a difference in expectations. Your goal is not to win the earnest money or the termination fee. All right, repair procedure. Here's how you want to look at repair procedures. In a nutshell, repair procedure is pre-agreed upon repairs. By going with repair procedures, the moment this contract is ratified, the buyer and seller have already agreed on the repairs that are going to happen. It's very important that you explain that to the buyers and that you explain that to the sellers. Okay, so Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I should say. Good news is they went with repair procedure. The reason that's good news is because we've already agreed on what issues that you're going to address. So what this says is that they're going to have requests, they're going to have the house inspected, and they're going to send any requests of what shall be completed by this date right here. These requests will be to place the heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, wastewater systems to convey an operative condition, to make the roof free of leaks, to address any environmental concerns, and to make improvements, to make the concerns and to make the improvements structurally sound if need be. We'll deliver those by the deadline below, or excuse me, above. Okay, so that's how you explain it to the seller. Per the contract, you're only required to address these. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is what the contract says. This is good news. And it's been my experience that 100% of the time, a buyer will more than likely ask for something that's outside of what this paragraph states. That does not make them a bad buyer. That just makes them a buyer, and they're probably going to ask for more. I just want to tell you that, so when this happens, you don't think anybody's trying to pull one over on you or anything like that. Just know that per the contract, you're only required to do what's stated right here. I'm not saying they won't ask for more, and you can always say you'll do more. If if something they ask for is going to cost an extra $20 and you got a contractor out here, you're willing to do so, just know you're not required to do so. Again, set them up for the fact that you may get someone who then just sends you the entire report and says things like it's safety, it's code, blah, blah, even though all of that's covered in there. Go ahead and prepare them that they may get more than what it covers. Doesn't mean they have to cover it. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. The good news is we're going with repair procedure. The reason that's good is it's going to make your offer more appealing. Here's what I want to explain to you. That you can have the house inspected. The only thing that the seller is required to repair is to make sure the heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, water systems, waste systems are in operative condition, meaning they can be 422 years old, and if they are functioning, they do not have to do anything with them. They need to make the roof free of leaks, meaning the house could be with its original roof from 1975, but if it is not leaking, they do not have to replace it. And then they have to address any environmental concerns, which include but aren't limited to, could be anything from a mold issue or anything that we have, and they have to make the home structurally sound. As long as all of those, the seller is willing to address them, when they say yes, then we stay in the contract and move forward. You want to be very, very clear with them what this looks like. I don't think it's an issue to go a little extreme on the buyer side, that they understand what repair procedure looks like. Not scare them out of it, because there is an appeal to repair procedure, especially in this market. We're seeing a lot more of them, especially in multiple offer situations. But they do need to understand that general maintenance, and here, the contract maps out a handful of things. Come back to the deadlines. Seller paid requests do not include the following items. It does not include general home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, and energy efficiency. If seller contractually agrees to make all the requested seller paid repairs, the parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. Okay, so again, it's very important to explain to both parties what their risk is and what the reward is, because there's one to both for both of them. All right, so once you receive this offer, or excuse me, these requests by this date here, which again just basically reiterates anything that is covered in here. It says that the buyer fails to notify the seller within this time frame, they've waived any and all rights under the terms. If lender's commitment requires any additional inspections or certification, these are to be provided by the buyer. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility to, this is super important, by the way. This is not being explained very well, really with any of it, but especially with a lot of people. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the mold, radon gas, lead-based hazards, including lead-based paints, wetland study of pertinent buildings, heating systems, and air conditioning system, electrical, plumbing, wastewater systems, and water systems, as well as pertinent equipment and appliances. Here's why it's important. We're seeing a lot of this right now. We have repair procedure. Inspector goes out, says air conditioning is 57 years old, maybe on its last leg, we recommend having an inspection by a licensed HVAC. And then the buyer requests the seller to do it. It's not the seller's job to do it. Stop doing that. If you're doing that, I'm not talking to you, but I am talking to you, because we see it a lot, right? If you have this is why it's important not to wait to the last minute. If you've got an old air conditioning system and it's functioning, you can't then go back under repair procedure and say, hey, my inspector tells me that this is on its last leg, so we want you to have it inspected. If I'm the seller, I'm saying no. The contract clearly states that you are to have it inspected. Okay, so just make sure you keep that in mind when you're hiring your inspector and explaining this to your client. Questions? So grandfathered code issues, that would be if anything comes up, typically they will say if such and such is not up to code, and then they'll date when the code is in there. If it doesn't, if they're not obligated to have brought it up to code, like let's say a perfect example would be, well, it wouldn't be a grandfather one, would be the opposite. If a water heater is the original and doesn't have an expansion tank, but still functioning, bringing it up it's grandfathered because it's the original. But if they had it replaced within the time frame of needing an expansion tank, then they would need to replace it with the actual correct expansion tank. But if it's functioning without it, they can't come back and say, well, it needs this, because then where do you stop at that point? Did that answer your question, Eileen? Okay. All right. This is where the fun part comes in. So after you've received this report, no later than blank PM, seller shall deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs in the buyer's repair request. So this is where it does reference repair requests, which is probably why you're going to use the repair request addendum. Here's where the confusion comes in. The repair request addendum has a notice of an expiration notice on it, or an expiration on it. That expiration does not supersede this date. We get this all of the time. This date here will say that I've got until Friday at 6 p.m. to respond as the seller, yet they send it to me on the repair addendum, and they put in a deadline Thursday at 6 p.m. And they say, well, the deadline, you've run past the deadline. You can't just add a deadline to a contract, right? So just beware of that. If you're going to use the repair addendum, the expiration deadline in there is a moot point. You cannot add an expiration to it. The seller has until the date that's stated here in paragraph 8. In the event, I'm going to keep hitting the wrong button. In the event that they do not do this, the seller, sorry. Let me go back to this. Seller will deliver by this time, agreeing or not agreeing to the repairs in the buyer's request. The cost of all repairs to heating, air conditioning, again, it specifies again what they're actually going to pay for. So this is where it comes down to negotiation. They can scratch some things that aren't included. This is where you get into the gray area. The big gray areas are going to be fascia board. They're going to be loose shingles. They're going to be missing shingles. They're going to be fogged windows, which are clarified now. By the way, windows that do not stay up is a gray area. It's not, some would argue, is not covered. It's safe. Everybody says that's a safety issue. There's nothing in here that claims safety issues that needs to be covered. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. This is where you have the time to say whether or not they're going to do it. The seller does not timely respond to make the all seller paid repairs. The buyer shall, within 2 calendar days from this day up here, choose one of the following: accept the property in its present condition, negotiate a new amended contract, which is going to be hard to do if you haven't heard from them yet, or terminate the contract by delivering notice. If after 2 calendar days after this date, you have not come to a resolution, then the buyer agrees to buy and the seller agrees to sell the property in as-is condition, which is all covered that we talked about a little bit earlier, meaning they're buying the house as it is. They've got an inspection and all kinds of fun stuff for informational purposes only. How are we feeling? Still got some, nobody's turned their camera off to have them on, so that's always a positive. All right, so the good news is even though we're only in paragraph 9 in page 4, the second half of the contract goes a little bit faster. So paragraph 9 basically states that the inspection and reinspection rights of buyer and South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors reasonably perform any reasonable ultimate non-destructive examination and make reasonable record of the property within reasonable notice. Basically, this is just reiterating that the buyer has the right and privilege to inspect the property. This says that the seller will make the property accessible for inspections and not unreasonably hold excess unless otherwise agreed in writing by the parties. Seller will grant the buyer the right to perform a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. Seller will keep all utilities operational through closing unless otherwise agreed upon. Now, seller will grant the buyer the right to perform a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. This does not say seller will have all repairs completed within 48 hours. One would assume that's what it means because it's a final walkthrough. But unless you've covered it through your repair addendum of when the repairs are going to be done, this does not cover it. This just simply says that they will be allowed to have a walkthrough within 48 hours of the closing. That walkthrough can be 30 minutes prior to the closing. Okay, so just keep in mind, this is not a deadline for repairs when you schedule the walkthrough. That is handled on your repair request. Seller grants permission to, buyer permission to connect the utilities. We don't really see that too often right now. We may start to see that coming back on as you start to get into any sort of distressed properties. What I will say on that is before you consider putting the utilities in your own name as a listing agent with any vacant properties, please see me first. And just until you know the answer, say no. And then once we find out the situation, we'll see whether or not that's something that you want to take the liability on for. Paragraph 10, appraised value. Basically, this is, I'm not going to read line by line, very easy to interpret this. It's either contingent or not contingent on appraisal. If the property does not appraise, one of 3 things can happen. Number 1, the seller can agree to drop the price to the appraised value. If the seller does that, everyone proceeds with closing, right? So if it comes in, if you're under contract at 275, it appraises at 270, the buyer agrees to sell it at 270, everyone moves forward under the rest of the terms of the contract. with the closing, the contract price changing to 270. Or the buyer can renegotiate. Buyer and seller can renegotiate to a new price, and that can include anything but not limited to people can concession on commissions, concessions on closing costs, concession on whatever it may be, or the seller can terminate the contract and everybody gets their money, or and the buyer gets their earnest money back. Okay, it's a pretty simple one. We are starting to see more of that. Quite a few of them actually. More on the high end side. The quick movement of the high end side is causing people to outbid each other and then appraisals to come in low. Just keep in mind, there's a somewhat of a practice. I don't know if I'd call it a common practice, but somewhat of a practice where people will say, well, we'll just take it. And then if that, we'll pay a higher price, but if it appraises for lower, then, that's a win for us on the buyer side. I can tell you it's probably 50-50 how many sellers, even though we're blue in the face and tell them that, if they decide to lower their price, they're safe. Or if it's an FHA loan, it's stuck with them for 6 months. They don't care. When the appraisal comes in low, emotions are high. It's more than likely late in the game. They don't like it. So it never should be part of the tactic in negotiations. That's just kind of a cautionary warning from my standpoint. All right. Check my questions. Lexi, is there a time limit around renegotiating between parties if the house doesn't appraise? There's not. That's a good question, actually. There is not one in there. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Now, keep in mind, obviously, the contract deadline or the closing date would limit anything happening too long. But if if this happens last minute and you need to renegotiate, this is a little bit of a challenge at this point, like of not having that automatic extension. Because let's say this happens 2 days before closing, and everybody agrees on the price. We just had this happen. It's been a busy week. We just had this happen where everybody agreed on the price, but then the buyer had something come up where they'd had to redo something with their loan, and it caused them to extend the closing, and the seller said, no, we're not going to extend it. And they didn't have to because it wasn't at no fault, right? Not that that says that in there. But during the negotiations of the appraisal, the buyer pissed the seller off, for lack of a better way to put it. Sorry, that probably should donate to KW Cares. It wasn't appropriate. The seller became unhappy with the buyer. And so when it came time to extend it, the buyer said no. And the buyer was willing to pay, everybody was willing to drop the price, and the buyer was even willing to pay more now if they would extend it, and they wouldn't do it. So there's not a time frame, Lexi. So it goes back to time is of the essence of the closing date on the negotiation standpoint. I'm willing to bet that if it doesn't, as the market continues like it is, they'll probably come up with some sort of time frame they'll throw in there in the next change. So Deb asks, was a third option, the property doesn't appraise, the contract is terminated? Yes. So 3 options are: seller agrees to the appraised price, they renegotiate the contract, or the contract is terminated. Wood infestation report. A couple different things on this. So this is the CO 100. The property sold is contingent or is not contingent upon who having it inspected. If it's the seller, keep in mind the seller has to order it, and order it within this time frame here. It is going to be selected by the buyer or the seller. Typically what we're seeing is the seller has to do it, selected by the buyer, paid by the seller. That's, in my opinion, kind of the casual way to do it. I default to Lynn on this. My wife, who is far smarter than I am as it relates to buyers, she has a very strong opinion that all of those should be buyers. The buyer needs to order it, the buyer needs to select them, and the buyer needs to pay them. This is just like having a home inspector. You've got someone that's representing you, that's going out and inspecting the property for you. Again, that's an opinion on business practice. The contract allows for any way to do so. If they have selected that the seller is going to do it and the seller is going to pay for it, but the buyer is going to select it, you may want to get from the buyer's agent who they're going to select. We have CO 100 inspections that run anywhere from $75 to $250. So just beware on that one from that standpoint. This is also pre-agreed upon inspection, or excuse me, repairs. They have to have the inspection done no earlier than 30 calendar days prior to the closing and no later than blank calendar days. You need to be aware of this. This can cause a default in the contract if you haven't had the report done no later than X calendar days. Now it says the report done, it does not say turned in. If the buyer is responsible for having the property inspected as indicated above, but does not have the property timely inspected for the report's required delivery time frame, the buyer waives any and all rights under the terms of this. This is very important, buyer's agents. If your buyer is selected here and they do not do it by this date, they are waiving their rights to this. Listing agents, if that's the case, should you be sitting back quietly hoping they miss that deadline? Just give me a nod yes or nod no.
Yes.
No.
No.
No. Remember, what is not the object of the contract? It's not the object to win the earnest money. The object of the contract is to get them to closing. Because here's what's going to happen in that standpoint. It's a trick question, so don't feel bad. Here's what's going to happen in that standpoint. Lexi's going to be the listing agent. I'm going to come in as the idiot buyer's agent who says, I'm going to have it inspected. And then about 10 days prior to calendar days, Lexi's like, shh, don't say anything. And then day 9 comes in and Lexi says, ha, you missed it. And you now have to buy the house, and this paragraph doesn't apply to you. How do you think my client's going to respond when I go back to and tell them that?
Not very
Not good.
Not good. And guess who's going to be paying for any damages that they come to the buyer at that point? Me, right? But yay, Lexi won, right? She stayed quiet. I'm just picking on you, Lexi. I know you would never do that, right? So again, just make sure you're communicating. Hey, Lexi, just a reminder that Friday is the deadline for the CL 100. I haven't seen any notice on you guys scheduling it. Do you have that scheduled? Do we need to get an extension? Okay. Again, you don't have to be a martyr. You don't have to walk the agent through it all. However, you do want to make sure, because again, the contract can be black and white. If it was not explained correctly by their agent, you're going to have an issue. So you just want to be making sure of that. All right. So if the wood infestation report reveals anything here, okay, let's just go ahead and take all of this mumbo jumbo out of it, because all this mumbo jumbo on paragraph, the second part of paragraph 11 is summed up in a 2-word phrase. And what is it? Clear CL 100. And nobody knows what that means, right? So basically what this paragraph is saying is whoever's agreed in the first part of it is going to go out and get the home inspection for CL 100, and they're going to provide a clear CL 100 report. If it does not come back clear, which is in the eyes of the beholder, the inspector, the attorney, and the lender, as well as the buyer, then you're going to have it cleared, which means the contractor is going to go back out, address any of the concerns that are on there. Typically, the concerns are going to be a high moisture reading, any evidence of current active infestation, or any previous damage that may be structural. Okay. If that comes up, the seller may, at the seller's option, address it. And if they do, the buyer moves forward. If they do not opt to address it, the buyer does not have to move forward. And a lot of times their bank won't allow them to move forward. And then they can terminate the contract if they want without penalty. Or you can agree to renegotiate and either get repairs or whatever it may be. This, like repair procedure, is pre-agreed upon, but not required. That's an important thing. As everyone comes in, we're dealing with this right now, comes in and says your client is absolutely contractually obligated to do those repairs. They need to be done by tomorrow. No, they're contractually obligated to do the repairs if they want to move forward on the contract. If they don't want to do the repairs, the contract does not require them to do the repairs. It then just allows the buyers to get out of the contract. So just be careful when you get into negotiations on throwing out the contractually obligated. If the CL 100 proves to have something wrong with it, the seller has the option to address it. And if they do, the buyer moves forward. If they opt not to do it, which 9 times out of 10, they're probably not going to do that. They're going to do the repairs because you've prepared them. Then everybody moves forward. Questions about that? Ooh, we got one. Clear letters required by certain types of loans. If so, what do we do with this section? So there's 2 things. There will be one of the requirements. It's kind of gray area whether or not it's a requirement, but I would just default that it is FHA and VA are going to require It's not always the loan that requires it. It's the contract that does, and therefore the loan does. So you'll find that a lot more often that the reason the loan officer or the lending institution wants it done is because the contract says it. The reason the attorney wants it done is because the contract states it. So if it's something that your buyer doesn't want done and the lender doesn't require, your buyer can always strike this. They do not have to. You can either do not, I mean, they give you the option now to have it not contingent. Before we used to do X's all the way through it. All right. Let's see. Paragraph, let's see. A seller refuses to make those repairs, buyer backs out, and seller relists the home. Do these repairs items from CO 100 have to be addressed in the seller's disclosure? Okay, so the question is let's say you get CO 100 issues and the buyer relists or seller relists the home. Does that have to be disclosed in the property disclosure? I'm going to answer this in two ways. 9 times out of 10, if you ask yourself the question, should it be disclosed? The answer is yes. That's just, again, you either find out now, find out later. Now, specifically, if you're representing the seller and you have some wood rot or some damages that come up, I would readjust, because what you don't want to have happen is you don't readjust because you don't want to spook the next buyer. The next buyer comes out, they get an inspection, they do all of these things, they find the same thing comes up, they move on, right? But now they're out there inspection and everything, and then they're at a cocktail party with buyer number 1, and buyer number 1 says, yeah, I remember I was under contract for that house, and I found the same problems. I'm surprised they didn't tell you. I mean, there's just no reason not to. Now, if you're asking as the buyer's agent, and I'm not saying this is what Casey is doing, so I'm not picking on you, Casey. If you're asking as the buyer's agent, my answer is not your problem. Like, this is not, you're not out there to patrol. If you want to shoot an email to the listing agent and say, hey, you may want to update your seller's disclosure, that's fine. I have a lot of people that seem to be kind of renegades about this that really want to go out and say they need to disclose, they need to disclose. I'm not saying they shouldn't. They absolutely should. I'm also saying that if you're representing the buyer and you're moving on, move on. Now, if you get a buyer that's interested in that property again and you know about it, you do have to disclose it to them. Just be careful you're not going out and trying to regulate how listing agents are handling their business, albeit improperly. I'm not saying that them not disclosing it is the right thing. It's not at all. Just want to use your energy wisely. All right. So lender doesn't require it to protect their interest in the property. So Deb goes, does the lender not require the CO 100? I'm not saying that. Most lenders do. A lot of lenders do, I should say, but they are separate from each other as it relates to the contract. Because also understand that the term CO 100 in South Carolina is called a WDO in Florida and called I can't remember what in Georgia. So the terms are all different. So they're typically separate from each other, but a lot of loan institutions will want it addressed, particularly if it's in the contract. All right, paragraph 12 basically says that it is the recommendation that the buyer have the property surveyed, the title examination done, elevation, wetlands. We recommend that all of these be done for their protection. They're not required to, but they should. See if there's anything else I've mentioned in there. Buyers are solely responsible to investigate pricing, availability, coverage, and requirements of insurance, flood for the property prior to signing contracts. This is a very important part, particularly when you have people looking for homes in James Island that they don't realize how expensive the flood insurance is going to be, and it's required. Okay. If you go in as repair procedure and you're buying a $200,000 house and you find out the flood insurance is going to be $10,000 a year, unless that kicks you out for financing, it is not a reason to get out of the contract. The contract specifically states right here that it is your responsibility to investigate the pricing of this prior to signing the contract. I'm not here to argue whether or not that's the most intelligent way for the contract to be written. I'm just here to tell you that's what the contract says. So you want to make sure that if your clients are pinching pennies and super strict on their budget, which they should be, I don't mean that to sound in a judgmental way, that they need to be doing that investigating ahead of time. By the way, not to backtrack a little bit, however, I should have said this earlier. Paragraph 3, buyer acknowledges opportunity to inquire about owners association issues, common area issues, master deed issues, parking, storage area, membership, lease issues, and finance equipment prior to signing contract. This is another area. You get under contract with someone and then you find out that there is a special assessment. You find out that there is an issue with capital contributions, or there is an issue with the stability financially of it. Technically, what that says in paragraph 3 is that you should have done that ahead of time. Now, we've currently got one that is, they found out that pending litigation is happening, or there's an insurance claim that was filed on the roof right now. And okay, that's a material fact that wasn't disclosed. That's a different situation if this was happening from the HOA than saying just, not knowing what's going on with it. All right, so we got agree with Lynn, buyer should select and pay for CO100. It doesn't really matter about the lender. There are a lot of termites in South Carolina. Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind, Gene, that's absolutely, it's the other thing to keep in mind is you need to prepare your buyers, especially if they're not from here, right? There are 3 types of homes or 2 types of homes in the Low Country, ones that have termites or that will have termites someday, right? It's like, and especially with moisture, right? You just got to understand that something will come up on the CO100 if the home is not brand new. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but this is why you should get an inspection. 13, survival, basically says that if anything after this is not, anything agreed upon in the contract is not observed prior to closing, it survives the closing. That's nice and all. You lose all leverage if you close. So if you're a buyer and something's not completely done and you're saying, well, paragraph 13 technically says it survives the contract, I don't think that should be, unless you're talking something minor, I don't know that I would really rely on that. Paragraph 14 states that the home warranty company is or is not included. It talks about who's going to provide it, who's going to pay for it, who the company is, and it also gives notice that brokers may receive compensation from the home warranty. Paragraph 15, fire or casualty or injury. Basically, this says if the property is damaged wholly or partially by fire or any other casualty, hurricane or earthquake now apparently too, the parties will have the right to, for 5 calendar days after notice of the damage, to deliver notice of termination to the other party. If they do not deliver the notice of termination, they proceed according to the contract, and the seller is to be responsible to repair all the damages, remit to the buyer in the amount of sufficient for repairs, or assign to the buyer the right to all proceeds from their insurance. So basically, if something comes up, you can go back and either terminate it, or you can move forward under one of these 3 options here. Them repairing, them giving you the sufficient amount for repairs, or if there are any insurance claims, they can assign it to you if that would be allowed by your lender. Paragraph 16. Property condition disclosure statement either is or is not has or has not been provided at ratification of the contract. If it has been, basically this whole paragraph says that seller has filled this out as honestly as possible, and if they do discover any material inaccuracy on it, that they will correct this inaccuracy and deliver notice to the buyer prior to closing. So this would come up with Casey's example. If something comes up in the CO100, it could come up under a litany of things. There's 2 schools of thoughts on the property disclosure. My school of thought on the property disclosure is it's a good start. And as a buyer, you have the privilege and right to inspect the property to confirm what the property disclosure says and make sure the property is sufficient for you to purchase. So when I'm explaining to a buyer, hey, this property condition disclosure has been filled out by the seller is not required to go around and check off the box on every single one of these. They are required to answer it to the best of their knowledge. So there is a chance that something will come up under the inspection that was not disclosed on here. That does not necessarily mean the seller is hiding anything. It's why we have inspections. Now, if we do find out it was something that was concealed and it's a big deal, and that happens, right? I mean, it does. And most of the time it doesn't. I had one a few years ago where it literally, absolutely, the seller had a leaky kitchen, had it repaired. It had been like 12 years They literally had just completely forgotten about it. That was it. And the buyer hit the ceiling when they had the inspection done and saw that there had been repairs done. And unfortunately, the agent was super duper emotional and tried to come in and, you know, beat everybody up. And it really was just the seller said, look, I filled this out. I put no, whatever it is, I don't know. And it simply was because I honestly did not think about it. So if you want to get out of the contract, you can get out of the contract. Like I'm completely fine with that. Just understand that you need to explain to your buyer, it's not set in stone just because it's in the property disclosure. I saw a question pop up. When purchasing vacant land, is there any reason for property disclosure? No, there is not. Typically, I don't know if that's part of the exemption form, but no, vacant land is not. And if you guys are getting, I know with the compliance, a couple people have gotten kicked back because they don't have property disclosure and it was vacant land. That's just send a note back and say it's vacant land. It's just because we missed it and just are checking off on that. All right. Lead-based paint, paragraph 17. If the house was built prior to 1978, then they must have the lead-based paint hazard disclosure forms that everyone signs, including the agents. Paragraph 18 says that any sexual offenders or criminal information, the brokers are not responsible for obtaining or disclosing that information. So, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if this is important to you, you need to go look it up yourself. Trust account interest, charitable contributions, 9 times out of 10, any escrow accounts are not interest bearing simply because the accounting of them is ridiculous. However, this doesn't tend to happen unless you've got high end properties or high net worth clients that are putting, 50% down on a luxury property as part of their earnest money because they know they're going to purchase it. They may not necessarily want the agent to, or excuse me, the escrow agent to put it into an interest bearing account. It technically says broker in here. And obviously, since we don't hold earnest money, it doesn't apply. However, it technically would go back to whoever the escrow agent is. South Carolina income tax and non-resident gain compliance. Basically, it says the seller and buyer will comply with the South Carolina tax laws regarding the state income tax withholding requirements. If the seller is not a resident and is not filed with their state income tax returns, the attorney can actually hold the projected taxes that would be at closing. So you just want to make sure that if this does apply to them, if they've moved out or they're currently a non-owner occupied property and they live out of the state, that they have spoken to their accountant and they know that the attorney and the accountant are on the same page.
Sorry, back to 19. Do we still check the may not?
You could put may not. Honestly, it's going to come to whether or not your client cares one way or the other. Most of the attorneys locally that have it do not have interest-bearing accounts, so it's kind of a moot point. All right, so entire and binding agreement. So this is one that parties agree that this contract expresses the entire binding agreement between parties. There are no other agreements, oral or otherwise, modifying the terms. This contract is binding in the parties of principals, heirs, personals, representatives, successors, yada, yada, yada. Basically, you don't have any agreements outside of this. You don't have any agreements that say, hey, I'm going to pay you the extra money that the lender didn't allow me to pay you, or I'm going to lease back to you for a certain period of time, or I'm going to have anything that's not tied to this agreement. Adjustments, paragraph 22, I'm going to speed up just a little bit. Adjustments basically say the buyer and seller agree that they're going to sell or prorate or annually or as appropriate on the closing date. So utilities or any waste, association fees, anything that's already been paid or will be paid anytime that it's done for a period of time that the seller lives in the house and the buyer pays for, or the buyer's going to live in the house that the seller pays for, to be prorated back to them. The day of closing belongs to the seller. This will be included but not limited to any rents if it's an investment property. The big one on here is going to be tax prorations. You definitely want to remind everyone taxes are paid in arrears. So that's why really up until about this month or next, actually the next couple months, your sellers are going to be paying a decent amount of taxes prorated at closing because the buyer is going to be paying the taxes next year. Just remind them when they see that number on there that they will be receiving the escrow money back that has been escrowed for what they would have paid in their taxes. 23 just says basically what happens if you default, if the seller defaults and if the buyer defaults. They can deliver notice of default to and terminate the contract. They can pursue any remedies available. Understand that a release is just that. If you do sign a release of contract that releases the earnest money, there is verbiage in there that says you are releasing the party from the contract. So if you do feel like there is anything, if you're, let's just say, for instance, a seller, and the buyer sends you a release, or you're going to send the buyer a release, if you don't have that, if you're going to go after that earnest money, or you're going to go after anything in addition to the earnest money, if you sign the release, even getting the earnest money yourself, you're basically foregoing any further remedy that you may have. All right, mediation. Paragraph 24 says if there is a dispute about this, that they agree to mediate before they actually will sue. There's a mediation process that's done through the NAR as well as the local association. Our local association does have a good list of mediators. I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, this ends up being handled, especially if it's an earnest money dispute, with a couple exceptions, with some people on the call can attest. This does end up normally being worked out between the brokers, depending on who the brokers are. Most of the companies, Carolina One, agent owned, a couple of the big ones, normally we get those worked out. Normally their brokers are level headed and that sort of thing. If not, though, we go to mediation, at which point, it's the parties will agree to all they do is really facilitate it. It's not binding mediation. So a lot of times if they go to that and they don't come to an agreement, then they continue on for any sort of legal disputes. I have not seen, as long as I've been a broker, I've never gotten into too big of a legal dispute as it relates solely to earnest money. Other parts of the contract, yes. Paragraph 25 basically says that everybody's entered this contract, have not been induced, they have not been promised anything, that their brokers are retained solely as licensed real estate agents and not an attorney, tax, financial advisor, appraiser, surveyor, engineer, mold, air quality expert, home inspector, or other professional service providers. This is one that I think is a fantastic, this one and the second one, the next one, paragraph 25 and 26. This is a great way for you to go into the script of how you're going to involve all of the people on your team throughout the transaction. So as it states in paragraph 25 or 26, Mr. Buyer or Mr. Seller, you have basically retained me as a licensed real estate agent. So there are going to be times throughout the transaction where we're going to be talking to any of these types of people. Now, if you don't have these types of people, I am absolutely more than happy to recommend somebody. And when that happens, I'm going to be there to facilitate a conversation, but this will be a good opportunity for you to speak directly to them because I don't want to mix up anything in the message. This is super important in an incredibly litigious society. I understand from an agent standpoint that we want to be involved, right? And we want to understand everything that's going on, and you should. That does not mean that you're the sole point of communication amongst everyone, right? And what happens is we kind of speak out of both sides of our mouth because these two paragraphs specifically state, hey, I'm not the pro in these areas, but then we take on as the communicator of all these areas that almost makes us look like the pro. And that kind of can be a mixed message that you're sending to your client. Lynn uses this as a perfect way. And again, I'm biased. She's my wife and she's fantastic. And she's really good when it comes to representing the buyers to say, look, I'm here with you. I'm here to help communicate, to decipher all of these along the way, but understand it's going to be me and that person communicating with you. So you're not always trying to piecemeal things or work things together in this. These two paragraphs are skimmed over and quite honestly, I think are a huge leverage for you to use when you're consulting with your buyers and sellers to say, hey, there's a reason we bring in third parties for different parts of this transaction. So when we have an issue with the CO100 or when we have an issue with this, that, or the other, that's not, you may be an expert. You may have a background in inspection, right? You may have a background in lending. You may have your CPA. That's fantastic. As it relates to this transaction though, that's not what you're here for. So just use that as an opportunity to introduce how you're going to communicate with the other members of your team. 27 says there will be broker's compensation paid at closing by the attorney settlement funds. And that this is all negotiable and that if it does not close, that the brokers will not be paid out of the closing if it's not done here, but it doesn't waive the seller's liability from commissions should the seller have defaulted on the contract. Page 28 is where you're going to enter any attachments. If you enter anything in this blank, my recommendation is if you type it in there, you star it and you put initials by it just to make sure people see it. So if you put in paragraph 5 or if you put in 504, even though it's been addressed on page 1 as well, I would initial it here to make sure that everyone understands that that's part of the contract. You don't want anything missed here. This is a time you can, if you have a short stipulate, like a lot of times people will add in here. There's a stipulation. Don't write this down. There's an actual one. I can send it to you if you email me, but it's about homeowners insurance. Buyer to have 5 business days to find satisfactory homeowners insurance, and it creates everything in there. If it's short enough, you can put it in here. You can also put it in an addendum. Paragraph 29, notice and delivery. Notice is a unilateral communication, offers, counteroffers, acceptance, termination, requests for better terms, and associated amendments or addenda. Notice to and from a broker representing a party is deemed notice to and from a party. All notice, consents, approvals, counterparts, and similar actions required under this contract must be in paper or electronic writing, which is an email, and will only be effective as the delivery to the notice, the address, email, fax written below. It's very important because on the next page, well, it's actually 2 pages later. The reason it has this information on here is if you send me notice and you have the wrong address on here, it's not technically notice as it's related to this. So just make sure you're putting the correct information on there, because any email sent to that email there is considered notice. Acknowledgement. This is basically saying any wiring instructions, anything as it relates to reading and reviewing in electronic contracts, the seller's disclosure, anything of those. You need to receive any legal counsel from attorneys prior to signing the contract. So after all this, even though we've come to you as the expert, if you have any questions, go to an attorney. Expiration of the offer. Again, this is important. If you are negotiating, you put an expiration of offer. That's today at 6. I respond today at 5:30. I need to extend the expiration of this offer because technically if I respond within that and then they sign it outside of that, you have a voidable contract. So if Kathy sends me an offer and I respond and it's, I've only given her till the end, I haven't changed it, therefore only giving her another 2 hours to respond, you technically have an issue there. The offer will expire automatically if no action is taken by either party 30 calendar days. Obviously that's kind of goes without saying if no one's sent any sort of official termination or rejection of offer. If you do have power of attorney that your parties are signing on this, that you have attached it, or it will be delivered within certain time frame. Everybody's signatures, everybody's disclosure addresses, or excuse me, notice addresses. And there we are. How exciting was that? Look, we started with 31 and we're with 29. I mean, this is good. Y'all vote with your feet. I'll take 30. I'll take 29 or 31 any day. Any questions? I do have a handful of things that I do want to go through really quickly. So if you have any questions while I'm doing that, drop them into the chat box. The first one is initials closed. If you have a contract that you're negotiating and a change is made to the contract and it is initialed by one party and not by the other, you have a voidable contract. We currently have a contract with a very large earnest money dispute, and one side's argument is that there is not a valid contract because there is missing initials. There are missing initials. We were within a week from closing when the dispute happened. The buyer had continued to move forward with inspections and everything from that standpoint. The non-initials were just, honestly, we were working on getting them and it just wasn't noticed. And now this has become an issue because we didn't have them closed. Now, I don't really think that the person fighting this is going to have a good chance because there are a lot of other actions. However, in the black and white statute of frauds, it's if it's not in writing, which closed initials would make it in writing, you may have an issue there. So when things get sent back for not closed initials, or when I talk about closing initials, that's why. Again, it's never a problem until it's a problem. So just keep that in mind. And if you think I'm picking on you, you know who you are. I promise I'm not picking on you. You're not alone. It's just a good example to give. Due diligence, terminated. I think that was it for that. All right, what other questions? All right, so
for due diligence, about how many days would you put out then? Because they have to get back to you. 10?
yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sorry, I know you answered that. You asked that earlier, and I answered you. I would start. One of the things that may be a good practice is to go ahead when you know you're submitting an offer, and you're pretty confident in it. Go ahead and start trying to schedule the inspection. Say, hey, we're negotiating this. When are you able to get out there? And that will kind of help you a little bit before you submit it, because again, it's going to be based on when your inspectors can get out there. I would say a good almost week to get the inspection back, submit results or submit requests, and negotiate whether or not they're going to do it. I think that's a fair amount of time to do. I think more than 2 weeks for due diligence is probably longer than most sellers are going to be confident or comfortable with. But again, it's going to come back to what your inspector can do. I mean, we just scheduled an inspection this week and they can't get out there till week after next. Now, granted, they want one certain inspector and he happens to be out of town. So it's kind of a loaded example, but just make sure, had we not communicated that ahead of time and we'd been under the gun, then we would have had a little bit of an issue. So Sean, are you still on here? Let me go back to, I wrote her question down and I have absolutely no idea what I wrote down. I can't read it. This could give you some full confidence in your broker in charge.
Joseph, I am still on. I'm
Yes.
having to submit a counter by 4 p.m. So
Okay.
time, but I'm not engaged.
Okay. So your termination, what was summarize your question for me again one more time?
Maybe not right now.
Okay,
I'm
sounds
in the
good.
Deadline. Thanks.
All right. All right. Anything else? All right. So next week, we're going to go through paragraph 8. We got a lot covered on that today, actually, a lot more, which is why we ran a little bit longer. It's hard to say that we don't spend more time on contract. It's never going to be an hour class for the whole purchase and sale. As we get into the buyer side and specific side, what those or seller side are going to be, what the required documents are. I want you to be comfortable with those. Again, my intention is each month to update based on experience of what we've recently seen. I will say in the last 90 days, maybe closer to 6 months, just because of the activity in the market, I've had one tab open the entire time that goes directly to real estate license law. Just because there's so much going on right now. What I will say, if I can give any advice that will solve a large portion of any conflict that we have right now, not all, but a large portion will be keep your emotions between the lines. And it's hard. It's hard. We're stressed about everything right now. Everyone's stressed about everything right now. And let's be honest, if you add someone that you don't feel is as smart as you to the other side of the deal, that even adds to more emotions. And this is your opportunity to step up and understand. We had one last week that honestly, they had sent terminations and were never going to extend anything by a day without the seller contributing an extra ridiculous amount of money. And me and the broker got on the phone and we walked line by line through the contract, explained where they had some misunderstanding in some areas, where we had some misunderstandings in areas, and we got to closing that day. We didn't have to extend it. Everyone was happy. And again, for every one of those, there's 5 where people just fly off the handle and everything's out of control. Don't be afraid to ask me questions. That's what I'm here for. So bring me in on anything that you feel is needed. And I'll help out as much as I can. So, all right. See you guys bright and early next Tuesday. Yay, repair procedure.
Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Y'all have a great afternoon. Call me if you need anything.
Thank you.